Welcome. There is nothing that needs doing right now. Whatever was on your mind before this moment is welcome to wait. It has waited before and it will wait again. And in the meantime, we are going to talk about something quite specific and quite unhurried, which is the superstitions that people held for centuries. The beliefs about luck and omens and the invisible forces that were thought to govern daily life. And we are going to go through them slowly and carefully, and with a great deal of attention to the ordinary details, because that is the kind of story this is. We will take our time. Let us begin. The word superstition is worth thinking about before we go any further, because it is a word that carries some judgment in it. To call something a superstition is to say, from a position of presumed knowledge, that the thing in question is not really true, that the person who believed it was mistaken, or credulous, or simply living in a time before better information was available, and there is something to this. Many of the beliefs we will discuss tonight were not well founded in the way that we now understand things to be, or not to be well founded. But it is also worth noting that the people who held these beliefs were not, as a general rule, foolish people. They were people trying to make sense of a world that was genuinely uncertain and genuinely dangerous, using the best tools available to them, which included the observations of their ancestors, the accumulated folk wisdom of their communities, and a general sense that the world was interconnected in ways that went beyond what was obviously visible. When you do not have germ theory, the question of why some people get sick and others do not is a genuinely open question. When you do not have modern meteorology, the question of why it rains on one day and not another is a genuinely open question. When you do not have a complete scientific account of the world, the gaps in your knowledge are filled with something, and what they are filled with is an attempt to find pattern and connection in observation, which is in fact exactly what science does. The superstitions were early, imperfect science. They were the attempt to find rules in a world of events that otherwise seemed random and threatening. With that said, let us go through them. Let us begin with one of the most widely held and most enduring of all superstitions, the belief in the evil eye. The evil eye was the belief that a person could, intentionally or unintentionally, cause harm to another person, an animal, or an object simply by looking at them in a certain way. The look, typically a look of envy or admiration or desire, was thought to transfer something from the looker to the looked at, something harmful that could cause illness, bad luck, failure or death. This belief is ancient. It appears in ancient Mesopotamian texts dating back over 5,000 years. It appears in ancient Egypt. It appears in ancient Greece and Rome. It appears throughout the Middle East, across the Mediterranean, across South Asia, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, among indigenous peoples of the Americas. It is one of the most geographically widespread beliefs in human history, appearing independently in cultures that had no contact with each other. The fact that it appears so widely, independently, suggests something important. Not that the evil eye is real, but that the psychological and social conditions that give rise to the belief in the evil eye are nearly universal. The belief arises wherever there is inequality, wherever some people have more than others, and wherever there is the anxiety that accompanies having something desirable that others might want. The evil eye is in part a social mechanism for managing the anxieties of inequality. If your neighbour envies your new calf, and the calf becomes sick the next day, The evil eye provides an explanation and also a way of thinking about the neighbour's envy as something dangerous and real. The protections against the evil eye were various, but they shared a general logic. An amulet, a physical object with protective properties, could deflect the look before it could do harm. The amulet might be worn around the neck, attached to the object being protected, hung in the doorway of the house. The specific amulets varied by culture. The Hamza hand, widely used across the Middle East and North Africa, a hand-shaped charm with an eye in the palm. The blue eye amulet, the nazar, still made and sold throughout Turkey and Greece and neighbouring countries. The coral horn amulet used in Naples and parts of southern Italy. The fig gesture, made by tucking the thumb between the first and second fingers, which has protective properties in several Mediterranean traditions. In ancient Rome, phallic amulets were used as protection against the evil eye. The phallus was considered an apotropaic symbol, something that averted evil, and were worn as pendants, carved on doorways, hung in public spaces. The Romans were not being obscene, they were being practical, using what was believed to work. The spitting 3 times on the ground, or spitting into the air, was a common protective gesture when the evil eye was feared. Admiring a baby and then failing to spit risked transmitting the evil eye to the child. In some cultures, you should never directly praise the beauty or health of another person's child without also making the protective gesture, because the praise itself containing admiration might transmit the harmful look. This created a social etiquette of backhanded compliments that served a protective purpose. You said the baby was ugly or unremarkable to prevent the evil eye from fixing on it. You said the new house was modest, the new calf thin, the harvest small. The understatement was protective magic. Let us now move to the superstitions surrounding salt. Salt was enormously valuable in the ancient and medieval world, as we have discussed in previous stories, and its value gave it a quality of significance that pure utility alone might not explain. Salt was associated with preservation, with purity, with the durability of things. And because of these associations, salt acquired a rich set of superstitious meanings. The most famous salt superstition is probably the belief that spilling salt brings bad luck. This belief was widespread across Europe and the Middle East and persisted for centuries. The spilling of salt was an ill omen. It foretold a quarrel or a misfortune, or in some versions, death. The most famous depiction of this belief in Western art is in Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, in which Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, is shown with a spilled salt cellar near his arm. Whether Leonardo intended this as a deliberate omen, or whether later interpreters read it into the painting, is a matter of some scholarly discussion, but it illustrates how firmly the spilled salt omen was embedded in the culture. The remedy for spilling salt was to throw a pinch of the spilled salt over your left shoulder into the face of the devil, who was believed to stand behind your left shoulder waiting for opportunities of this kind. This is one of the most practically detailed of superstitious remedies. The precise shoulder, the precise direction, the logic of throwing something into the face of a lurking adversary to distract or deter them. Why the left shoulder? The left side has a long history of negative association across many cultures. The Latin word for left, sinister, also means ominous or threatening, and this association was not coincidence. It reflected a genuine cultural belief that left was the bad side and right was the good side. Omens seen on the left were bad. Actions performed with the left hand were suspect. The devil stood on your left. The salt went over the left shoulder. This left-right asymmetry appears across an enormous range of superstitions and cultural practices. The word sinister tells the story in its etymology. The word for right in French, droit, also means correct, upright, just. The association of rightness with right and wrongness with left is encoded in the language itself, which tells us how deep the association went. Wearing shoes on the wrong feet, left shoe on right foot, was considered very bad luck. Getting out of bed on the wrong side, the left side, started the day badly, hence the expression getting up on the wrong side of the bed. Even the arrangement of guests at a dinner table, the precedence in a procession, the placement of the groom and the bride at the altar, all of these reflected the right-left distinction that was so fundamental to the symbolic ordering of the world. Let us now consider the superstitions around new things, a new house, a new ship, a new garment, a new tool. All of these were vulnerable to bad luck in the period before they had been properly established, before they had been shown to be safe and functional. The first use of a new thing was a threshold moment, a moment of uncertainty in which the thing might fail or go wrong, and this uncertainty attracted superstitious attention. The launching of a ship was one of the most extensively ritualized of new thing ceremonies. The breaking of a bottle of wine against the bow of the ship, the practice most familiar to modern observers, is a direct descendant of older practices in which the ship was consecrated with blood, or with libations poured to the sea gods, or with sacrifice. The logic was the same in all cases. The new ship needed to be introduced to the sea and to the powers that governed it, before it could be trusted to sail safely. If the bottle failed to break on the first attempt, if it bounced off the bow intact instead of shattering, this was a very bad omen for the ship. The vessel was considered ill-fated. Sailors who knew the tradition were less willing to crew such a ship. Some ships that had survived an unbroken bottle at launch were subsequently involved in disasters, and the unbroken bottle was cited as the explanation after the fact. The first catch of the season for a fishing boat was treated with particular care in many fishing communities. You did not throw back the first fish caught. It was bad luck. In some traditions, the first fish of the new season was kept or given to the church, or had certain rituals performed over it before ordinary fishing could proceed. The first of any productive sequence was special, marking the beginning, setting the tone for what followed. New Year superstitions were an elaborate form of this logic applied to time. The first day of the new year was the threshold between the old year and the new, and what happened on that first day set the pattern for the year that followed. It was important to have money in your pocket on New Year's Day, because having money in your pocket on the first day meant having money throughout the year. It was important to eat certain foods: black-eyed peas in the American South, lentils in parts of southern Europe, herring and pickled fish in parts of northern Europe, each one associated with prosperity or luck. It was important to enter the new year with the right foot, literally stepping over the threshold on the right foot rather than the left. The first person to enter your house on New Year's Day, the first footer, was enormously significant in Scottish and Northern English tradition. This person's characteristics predicted the character of your year. A tall, dark-haired man was the ideal first-footer. He brought good luck. A woman as first-footer was less fortunate. A red-haired person was particularly bad. The first-footer should bring gifts: coal for warmth, whiskey for good cheer, bread for sustenance, salt for flavour. The specific gifts required by the first-footer varied by location and by period, but the logic was always the same. The first visitor of the year symbolically brought with them the gifts of the year, and those gifts should be good ones. Let us now think about the superstition surrounding the moon. The moon was one of the most observed objects in the sky throughout human history, and its phases, the regular cycle from new moon to full moon and back, were one of the most reliable patterns in the natural world. The month, the word itself derived from moon, was organized around this cycle. The tides were visibly governed by the moon. The behavior of certain animals seemed to correlate with the lunar cycle. It was therefore not unreasonable to suppose that the moon's influence extended beyond what was directly observable. If the moon moved the tides, and this was visibly true, perhaps it moved other things as well. Perhaps the fluids of the human body, which the ancient physicians called humours, were similarly affected. Perhaps the growth of plants responded to the moon. Perhaps the cycles of illness and health had a lunar dimension. Many of these beliefs had practical applications. Planting by the moon was a widely held agricultural practice, with rules specifying which crops should be planted in the waxing moon and which in the waning, which tasks should be done near the full moon and which near the new. Root vegetables were planted in the waning moon because they grew downward, and the decreasing moon pulled energy downward. Leaf vegetables were planted in the waxing moon because they grew upward, and the increasing moon drew energy upward. These rules were followed by farmers for centuries, and are still followed by adherents of biodynamic agriculture today. Whether they have any basis in fact is a matter of current investigation. Some studies suggest possible effects, others do not. But their persistence suggests that the people who followed them believed them to work, and that belief was strong enough to sustain the practice through many generations. The full moon was associated with madness. The word lunatic comes from the Latin luna, moon, reflecting the belief that mental instability was connected to the lunar cycle. The full moon was the time when the disturbed were most disturbed, when the violent were most violent, when strange things were most likely to happen. Hospital staff, nurses and police have repeated versions of this belief in modern times, though the evidence for any actual correlation between the full moon and disturbed behaviour is quite weak. But the belief persisted. It persisted because when something strange did happen at the full moon, and strange things happen all the time across all phases of the moon, the full moon provided a ready explanation. And when strange things happened at other lunar phases, the correlation was less salient, less noticed. The full moon explanation was available, and the human mind, which is very good at finding patterns and less good at remembering the cases where the pattern did not hold, remembered the full moon confirmations and forgot the non-full moon incidents. This is confirmation bias, and it is one of the deep engines of superstition. We notice when the omen was followed by the predicted outcome. We do not notice, or weight less heavily, the times when the omen was followed by nothing in particular. Let us now consider the superstitions surrounding mirrors. The mirror in ancient and medieval cultures was not the clear, precise, cheap object it is today. Glass mirrors of good quality were rare and expensive. Most people's experience of their own reflection was through water, a still pool, a bowl of water, or through polished metal surfaces which gave an imperfect, slightly distorted image. The mirror was something close to magical in its fundamental operation. It showed you yourself, reversed, looking back at you from within the glass. The belief that breaking a mirror brings 7 years of bad luck has ancient origins. The 7-year period was not arbitrary. It was related to the belief that the body renewed itself completely over a cycle of 7 years, and that therefore the misfortune attached to the broken mirror would persist until the body had fully renewed. The mirror in this belief was not merely glass and silver. It was connected to the soul of the person reflected in it. The soul in the mirror, the reflection, was a real soul in the thinking of the time. This is why vampires who have no soul cast no reflection. This is why covering mirrors in a house of mourning was a common practice. You did not want the soul of the deceased to become confused and trapped in the mirror. This is why you should not let a baby see its own reflection too early, for the soul had properly settled into the new body. The logic of the mirror belief was consistent once the premise was accepted. If the reflection was connected to the soul, then damaging the reflection by breaking the mirror was damaging the soul, and a damaged soul would not be repaired quickly. The remedy for having broken a mirror, various cultures offered various remedies, typically involved a ritual, grinding the glass to powder so that no reflection could form in the fragments, burying the pieces, putting them in a flowing stream to be carried away. The carrying away logic was common in superstition. Flowing water purified and removed bad luck, carrying it away downstream to somewhere that was not your problem. Let us think about the superstition surrounding birds, because birds occupy a special place in the folklore of omens across nearly every culture that has had contact with them, which is to say every human culture. Birds were observers from above. They could fly, which humans could not. They moved between the earthly and the aerial realms in a way that seemed to give them special knowledge, special access to what was coming. The direction of bird flight, the behavior of birds before storms, the appearance of unusual species, all of these were read as signs. Ravens and crows were particularly significant omens across much of Europe, Asia, and North America. Their intelligence, their dark colour, their raucous voices, their habit of gathering at sites of death, all of these made them natural vehicles for dark omens. A single crow was bad luck, 2 crows were good luck, 3 were for a girl, 4 were for a boy. The counting of crows and the reading of their number as an omen was summarized in various versions of rhymes that persist to this day. The raven was a bird of prophecy in Norse mythology, where Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, flew across the world each day and returned to whisper what they had seen into the gods' ears. The raven as messenger, as intelligence, as the carrier of knowledge from distant places, and this symbolism made the appearance of a raven meaningful, a potential message from the world beyond ordinary sight. The magpie was another heavily omened bird. The counting of magpies and the association of their number with predictions. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, and so on. is a tradition that has been recorded in England since at least the 18th century and is still widely known. The specific predictions attached to specific numbers of magpies varied by region and by period, but the logic was consistent. Seeing a single magpie was a bad sign, and the remedy was to acknowledge the bird specifically, to greet it, to bow or tip your hat, to say a specific phrase, in order to avert the bad luck. The greeting of the single magpie is still practiced by many people in Britain who consider themselves entirely rational in all other respects. The practice has survived the rationalization of most other superstitions because it is cheap, because it takes only a moment, and because the downside of not doing it, even for someone who rationally thinks it makes no difference, is that you spend the rest of the day with a small background anxiety about the ungreeted magpie. Better to just greet it. This is a rational account of why irrational beliefs persist, and it applies to many superstitions. The cost of following the practice is low. The cost of not following it, if it happens to be true, is potentially high. Expected value reasoning, even unconscious expected value reasoning, tends to favour the cheap protective practice. The owl was a mixed omen. In ancient Greece, the owl was associated with Athena, goddess of wisdom, and was therefore a good omen, particularly in Athens where the owl appeared on coins. In many other cultures, the owl's nocturnal habits, its silent flight, its habit of appearing near burial grounds where its prey lived, and its eerie call made it an omen of death. Hearing an owl hoot near your house, or seeing an owl in the daytime, which was unusual and therefore notable, was understood in many traditions as a warning of death. The robin was more cheerful in British folk tradition, a bird associated with Christmas, with good luck, with a connection to the dead who sent it as a messenger. Killing a robin was very bad luck, a belief that persists in Britain to this day. The specific protections attached to the robin made it safer than most birds to have around, which served the robin well, which may be why the belief persisted. Robins that lived near humans prospered, and the folk belief that kept humans from harming them was reinforced by the robin's own tendency to be tame and approachable. Now let us think about the superstition surrounding numbers. The number 13 has been considered unlucky across much of Western culture for centuries, and the specific reasons for this unluckiness have varied, but the unluckiness itself has been remarkably stable. 13 at a dinner table was unlucky. One of the 13 would die within the year. The 13th floor of a building was so unlucky that many buildings simply did not have one. The numbering went from 12 to 14, because the psychological reality of the fear was real, even if its basis was not. The origin of the 13 superstition has been attributed to various sources. The Last Supper, with its 13 participants, Jesus and 12 apostles, ending in the betrayal and crucifixion. The Norse myth in which 12 gods were feasting, and Loki, the trickster, appeared uninvited as the 13th, leading to the death of Balder. The number 13 as a number just beyond the 12 of the complete cycle. 12 months, 12 hours, 12 apostles, 12 tribes, the number that stepped outside the established order. The day and number combination of Friday the 13th was particularly unlucky, the bad luck of the number, combining with the bad luck of the day. Friday was the day of Christ's crucifixion in the Christian tradition, and therefore a day of misfortune. It was also the day associated with Venus, with the female, with things that were unpredictable and powerful in unsettling ways by the standards of the patriarchal cultures that generated these beliefs. The specific fear of Friday the 13th was given a name in the 20th century, paraskeviderkatriophobia, one of the longest and most satisfying medical-sounding words in the English language, coined to describe something that required only that the person feel anxious when the date in question appeared on the calendar. The number 7, by contrast, was almost universally lucky. 7 days of the week, 7 ancient planets visible to the naked eye, 7 deadly sins, 7 virtues, 7 notes of the musical scale. The 7th son of a 7th son was born with special powers of healing or prophecy in British and Irish tradition. The 7th year brought transformation, for better in some traditions, for worse in others. The number 3 had a magical quality that it shared with 7. Things done in threes were more effective than things done once or twice. Bad luck came in threes. The 3rd time was the charm. 3 candles burning in a room were unlucky. 3 candles was the number used to light a coffin at a wake. The power of 3 was so embedded in folk belief that it functioned almost as a law of magic. If you wanted a spell to work, you did it 3 times. If you wanted a wish to come true, you wished for it 3 times. If you wanted to break a curse, you broke it in 3 stages. The number 3's special status may derive partly from the logic of the minimum sample. 2 instances of anything might be coincidence. 3 instances form a pattern. The human mind, pattern-seeking by nature, found the 3rd instance of anything to be the one that made it real, that established the pattern, that demanded explanation. 3 was the number at which randomness became structure, at least to the perceiving mind. Let us now think about the superstitions surrounding doors and thresholds. The threshold of a house, the transition between inside and outside, between the domestic and the public, between the known and the unknown, was a charged space in the folk belief of many cultures. Crossing a threshold was a significant act. The threshold needed to be protected, and that protection required specific practices. In ancient Rome, the threshold had its own deity, Lanus, the two-faced god who looked in both directions simultaneously, whose name gave us the month of January and the word janitor. Janus presided over beginnings, transitions, doorways and passages, and was invoked at the start of any significant undertaking. His 2 faces, one looking back at the past, one looking forward at the future, were the perfect image of the threshold moment poised between what had been and what would be. The practice of carrying a bride across the threshold on her wedding night was protective magic. The bride, transitioning from her old life to her new one, was at a moment of vulnerability, between identities, between states, and this vulnerability made her susceptible to evil spirits, or bad luck that might be lurking at the threshold. Carrying her over the threshold prevented her from stumbling on it, which was bad luck, and perhaps also prevented direct contact with the threshold's possible dangers. Evil spirits, in many traditions, could not cross a threshold that had been properly protected. The protection took various forms. Iron was an extremely widespread threshold protection. Iron was considered inimical to witches and fairies and various other spirits, and a horseshoe over the door, or a piece of iron buried under the threshold, or iron nails driven into the doorpost, would prevent entry by these beings. The horseshoe itself needed to be hung with the opening facing upward, to catch and hold good luck rather than letting it spill out. The witch could not enter a house without being invited, or without walking backwards across the threshold in some traditions. The vampire could not enter without invitation. These specific limitations on supernatural beings' ability to cross thresholds reflect the more general belief in the threshold as a line of protection that could be maintained or broken. The mezuzah, the small case containing a parchment scroll with verses from the Torah, affixed to the doorpost of a Jewish home, is a religious practice with protective dimensions. The placement at the threshold, the specific verses used, the touching and kissing of the mezuzah when passing through the door, all of these mark the threshold as a sacred and protected boundary. The painting of thresholds in blue, particularly in parts of North Africa and the Middle East, and in hoodoo tradition in the American South, there was another form of threshold protection. Blue was the colour of heaven, and therefore of divine protection. Evil spirits would not cross a blue threshold. The threshold required daily management in many traditions. You did not step on the threshold. You stepped over it. You did not leave shoes on the threshold. You did not stand half in and half out of the door for any extended period, because being between the spaces was itself a vulnerable state, an invitation to something. Let us now consider the superstitions surrounding black cats. The black cat is one of the most familiar of Western superstitions, but the specific meaning attached to the black cat has been remarkably variable across cultures and time periods. In Britain and Japan, a black cat crossing your path is good luck. In the United States and much of continental Europe, the same crossing is bad luck. The specific direction from which the cat crosses the path has also mattered in various traditions. The association of black cats with witches was firmly established in medieval and early modern Europe. The witch's familiar, the spirit companion that assisted the witch in her magic, was often a black cat, and the black cat might be the witch herself in transformed shape. Black cats seen at night, moving silently and independently through the darkness, had an uncanny quality that was easy to attach to supernatural meaning. This association had consequences for black cats, who were killed in considerable numbers during the periods of intense witch persecution in Europe. The ecological consequence of this persecution was, according to some historians, a reduction in cat populations that allowed rat populations to expand, which may have contributed to the spread of the plague. The superstition had practical, measurable effects on the physical world, though not the effects that the superstition's holders had intended. The positive view of the black cat is equally old. In ancient Egypt, all cats were sacred, associated with the goddess Bastet, worshipped, mummified at death. The black cat, as lucky in Britain, may preserve a more favourable pre-Christian attitude toward these animals, or may have developed for other reasons. Sailors' tradition, for instance, held that a black cat aboard ship was exceptionally lucky, and a ship's cat that was black was particularly prized. The tortoiseshell cat was particularly lucky in British tradition. The tortoiseshell or calico pattern was called money cat in some American traditions, believed to bring financial luck to the household that kept one. The ginger cat was sometimes associated with luck as well. The white cat, by contrast, was in some traditions an omen of death or illness, while in others it was neutral or positive. These variations illustrate something important about superstitions. They are local, traditional, and often contradictory. The same sign means different things in different places. This is not a failure of the system. It is a feature of a system based on local tradition rather than universal principle. You follow the tradition of your community, which has different particulars from the tradition of the community 3 valleys over. Let us now think about the superstitions surrounding shoes. Shoes were powerful objects in folk belief across many cultures. They were intimate objects. They conformed to the wearer's feet over time, taking on the shape of the person who wore them. They were protective objects. They stood between the wearer and the ground. They were transitional objects. You put them on when you entered the world and took them off when you retreated to the private space of home. Throwing a shoe after a departing traveller was a practice that appears in many European traditions as a way of ensuring their safe return. The shoe sent symbolically after the traveller was connected to them, a piece of the home following them out into the world, ensuring their bond with the home they left. This practice survives in the tying of shoes to the back of a wedding car, which is a direct descendant of the old tradition. Old shoes hidden near walls of buildings during construction were found throughout Britain and Europe in the 20th century, as old buildings were renovated and demolished. The shoes, typically a single shoe, often a child's shoe, worn and soft from use, were placed in cavities in walls, under floors, above ceilings. The practice of putting worn shoes in buildings was widespread enough to require an explanation, and the most convincing explanation is that the shoe was a guardian spirit of a kind, its intimate connection with its wearer's body, giving it something of the wearer's protective presence, its worn and used character showing that it had been part of a lived life and carried that life's energy. The shoe in the wall was a spirit trap in some accounts. It attracted and captured the witch or evil spirit who might otherwise harm the building's inhabitants, the warm intimacy of the old shoe drawing the spirit in and holding it. The specific superstitions around new shoes were numerous. New shoes should not be put on a table because they would bring bad luck, specifically associated with death. The shoes on the table were in the position of coffin shoes, shoes placed on a table at a wake. New shoes should never be given as a gift without also receiving a coin in return. Otherwise, the shoes would walk the recipient away from the gift giver. Squeaky shoes were considered by some traditions to be shoes that had not been paid for, the squeak being the shoe calling out that it had been stolen, a convenient belief that happened to ensure the cobbler was paid promptly. Now let us move to the superstitions surrounding fire. Fire was one of the most necessary and most dangerous things in any pre-modern household, and it accumulated a significant body of folk belief around itself. The behaviour of a fire, the way it burned, the sounds it made, the shapes it produced, was read as an omen in many traditions. A fire that burned bright and steady was a sign of good things to come. A fire that sputtered and went out unexpectedly was a bad sign. A fire that produced sparks, shooting small pieces of glowing material out from the main fire, was read variously. A spark landing on you indicated a letter was coming, or a stranger was coming, or money was coming, depending on the tradition. The sound of the fire was significant. A crackling, popping fire was generally good. A fire that made a low, moaning sound was bad. A fire that produced a hollow, booming sound, not common, but possible when a large bubble of gas in the wood exploded, was a death omen. The colour of the flames was significant. blue flames in a fire were particularly noted. A fire that burned with a distinctly blue colour was either a sign of frost to come or a sign of the presence of a spirit or a witch, depending on the tradition. The chemistry of fire was not understood in medieval or early modern times, and the occasional blue flame that appeared when certain minerals in the wood burned had no natural explanation available. Therefore, it received a supernatural one. The sharing of fire, the transfer of flame from one hearth to another, was a ritual act in many communities, particularly at Beltane, the Celtic Spring Festival, when all fires were extinguished and then relit from a central communal fire. The extinguishing and relighting of domestic fires from a shared communal source was a symbolic act of community renewal, the whole community starting fresh from the same flame. The Yule log at Christmas and the midwinter festivals of Northern Europe served a similar function. The log was lit with a piece of the previous year's Yule log, which had been saved specifically for this purpose. The continuity of the flame, this year's fire lit from last year's fire, maintained a connection across time, a thread of continuity from one year to the next. Letting the fire go out entirely in many traditions was not merely an inconvenience, but a breaking of that thread of continuity, a rupture that might have consequences. The hearth fire that had been burning for years, lit from the previous owner's fire, was connected to the history of the household, and its extinguishing was a significant event. Let us now think about the body of superstitions surrounding sneezing. The sneeze was, in ancient belief, a moment of spiritual vulnerability. The soul was thought to be capable of leaving the body through the mouth or nose, and the violent expulsion of a sneeze, the sudden uncontrollable blast of air from the nose, might take the soul with it, or might create an opening through which a spirit could enter. The blessing after a sneeze, God bless you, Gesundheit, à vos souhaits, was protective magic. It called divine protection at a moment when the sneezer was momentarily vulnerable. The ancient Greeks and Romans thought of the sneeze as a kind of oracle. A sneeze at a moment when something was being discussed, or a decision was being made, was taken as a sign about the outcome of that discussion or decision. A sneeze to the right while a matter was being decided meant yes. A sneeze to the left meant no. Xenophon, the Greek soldier and writer, records that his army was deciding whether to continue fighting, and a soldier sneezed at exactly the right moment to be interpreted as a divine sign in favour of continuing. The achoo and the consequent blessing was not merely a politeness in the ancient and medieval understanding. It was a quick spiritual first aid. Stitching closed the momentary opening in the sneezer's defences, calling divine attention to the vulnerability before anything bad could happen. The specific formulas of blessing varied by culture and religion, but the logic was the same. Across all of them, a moment of vulnerability at the sneeze, a blessing to address it, a restoration of the sneezer's integrity. There was also the belief in some traditions that you should not sneeze in bed in the morning, that sneezing upon waking was an especially bad omen, and the belief that 3 sneezes in a row was particularly significant, 1 for a wish, 2 for a kiss, 3 for a letter, depending on the version of the counting rhyme. Sneezing during a conversation was significant. If someone said something and you sneezed immediately, you were confirming the truth of what they said. The sneeze was the body's involuntary confirmation of a truth it recognized, even if the conscious mind was not certain. Now let us think about itching. The itching of various parts of the body was read as an omen in folk traditions across Europe and elsewhere. An itching right palm meant money coming, an itching left palm meant money going out, an itching nose meant a fight was coming, or a stranger was coming, or you were going to be kissed. The specific prediction varied. An itching ear meant someone was talking about you. The left ear for bad things being said, the right ear for good. The itching of the right hand was perhaps the most widely distributed of these beliefs, appearing in traditions as far separated as those of rural England and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The right hand, the hand of transactions, of the handshake, of the giving and receiving, was naturally associated with money and exchange, and the itching of it as a sign of money coming was a satisfying piece of sympathetic magic. To make the money prediction come true more reliably, one should rub the itching palm on wood, a piece of wood furniture, the trunk of a tree, a wooden floor. This practice appears in numerous traditions. Why wood? Wood was a natural material with general lucky associations. Wood was associated with growth, with trees, with the living world. The rubbing of an itchy palm on wood was perhaps the channeling of the palm's anticipatory energy into the most receptive and auspicious material available. The itching of the feet, the sole of the right foot, predicted travel, a journey coming. This was a slightly less common superstition, but appeared in various European traditions and made a certain sympathetic logic. The foot being the instrument of travel, its itching was the body's anticipation of movement. Let us now consider the superstitions surrounding the number of people at a gathering. We have already discussed the unluckiness of 13 at a dinner table, but the numbers of people at various occasions and in various configurations carried meaning in folk belief beyond the table of 13. An odd number of people gathered for certain purposes was unlucky in some traditions. Planting crops should be done by even numbers of people. Building work should be started with an odd number of workers, because an odd number meant the work would be completed. You could not divide the group evenly. One side would have the majority, and that majority would push the work to its end. The number of mourners at a funeral, the number of bridesmaids at a wedding, the number of candles on a birthday cake. All of these carried meanings and rules in various traditions. The specific rules varied enormously by culture and period, but the underlying logic was consistent. Numbers carried power, and the power of the number was engaged by any occasion that organized a specific number of people or objects. Now let us think about the superstitions of sailors, because sailors had a particularly rich tradition of superstition, for reasons that are easy to understand. The sea was dangerous in ways that were genuinely unpredictable, and the consequences of things going wrong at sea were severe and swift. In an environment where luck and misfortune could genuinely determine whether you lived or died, the management of luck through superstitious practice was not unreasonable. Whistling on a ship was almost universally forbidden among British and Northern European sailors. To whistle was to whistle up a wind, and whistling up a wind at sea was dangerous. Winds were unpredictable and could quickly become too much of a good thing. A gentle breeze could become a gale if encouraged imprudently. The specific prohibition on whistling in heavy weather or in calm weather at sea reflects this logic. In calm weather, you might desperately want wind, but whistling for it was reckless because you might get more than you wanted. The exceptions were interesting. A ship's cook was sometimes allowed to whistle in the galley. The thinking being that a cook who was whistling was not eating the food he was supposed to be cooking. You cannot whistle with a full mouth. The whistling cook was therefore honest, not pilfering. Similarly, some traditions permitted a ship's boy to whistle quietly and carefully, as if asking rather than demanding, to encourage a light breeze in a dead calm. Women on ships were considered bad luck by many traditions of maritime superstition. Women brought bad weather. Women distracted the crew. Women upset the equilibrium of the all-male world of the working ship. The specific reasons given varied, but the general prohibition was widespread. This prohibition coexisted with the tradition of the ship's figurehead, which was frequently a female figure, and which was considered to calm the sea and protect the ship. Nude female figures as figureheads were considered particularly powerful because they could shame the sea into good behaviour, and they had a calming effect on storms. The figurehead as protective magic was one of the most persistent traditions of Western seafaring. The carved, painted figure at the bow of the ship was not merely decorative. It was a spirit of the ship, a guardian, the face that the ship presented to the sea. Damaging a figurehead was unlucky. A figurehead that was lost or badly damaged was a very bad sign for the ship and its crew. Renaming a ship was extremely unlucky. The ship's name was its identity, registered with Neptune and the spirits of the sea, and changing it was a betrayal of that registration. If you must rename a ship, and sometimes there were practical reasons to do so, the ceremony of denaming and renaming required elaborate ritual to avoid the consequences, removing every trace of the old name from the ship, including from the log and all records, performing a ceremony of dedication to the new name, making offerings to Neptune. The albatross was one of the most revered and feared birds of the sea in maritime tradition, particularly in British and Atlantic naval culture. Killing an albatross was catastrophic bad luck. The albatross carried the soul of a dead sailor, and to kill it was to kill the sailor and invite the dead sailor's misfortune upon yourself and your ship. This belief was so firmly held that albatrosses were allowed to follow ships unmolested, fed and protected, the crew watching their soaring flight with something between affection and superstitious awe. Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner is the most famous literary treatment of this tradition, and its power in the culture was such that it reinforced and spread the belief even to people who had never been to sea. Let us now think about the superstition surrounding plants. Plants occupied an important place in folk belief because plants were important in practical life, as food, as medicine, as material for tools and building and fuel, and the important things in life tended to accumulate superstitious associations. Elder trees were among the most carefully treated of all plants in British and Northern European tradition. The elder had a spirit, the elder mother, or Hildemor in Scandinavian tradition, who lived in the tree and who was both potentially helpful and potentially dangerous. You did not cut an elder tree without asking permission of the elder mother. You did not burn elder wood because burning the wood released the spirit and it would harm the person who had burned it. You did not bring elder branches into the house without specific invitation. At the same time, elder was one of the most medicinally useful plants in the folk pharmacopoeia. Elder flowers and elder berries were used for food and medicine. The elder could protect against witches and evil spirits if approached correctly. The contradiction. The tree was both dangerous and useful, its spirit both a protector and a threat, was managed by the elaborate etiquette of asking permission, of treating the tree with respect, of acknowledging its power before making use of it. Rowan trees were protective against witches and against evil spirits more broadly. A rowan planted near the house protected the household. A branch of rowan placed over the doorway prevented witches from entering. Carrying a piece of rowan, a small twig, a charm made from rowan wood, was protective against enchantment and the evil eye. The red berries of the rowan were particularly powerful. The specific logic of rowan's protective power was related to its colour. The red berries were the colour of blood, which was protective, which was associated with life and power, and to its location, which was often on rocky, high, exposed places where it grew in conditions that other plants could not tolerate. A plant that grew in such extreme conditions, that endured what other plants could not, obviously had power. Hawthorn, the May tree, the tree that bloomed in May, was a tree of boundaries and thresholds, associated with fairies, with the threshold between the fairy world and the human world. Bringing hawthorn blossom into the house was very bad luck. It brought death into the house, because hawthorn blossom was associated with death and coffins, its smell reportedly similar to the smell of rotting flesh. This smell association may have had a factual basis. Hawthorn blossom contains trimethylamine, a chemical also produced in decaying animal tissue, which accounts for the association with death and decay. The smell that was interpreted as the smell of death was, of course, just the smell of hawthorn flowers. But once the association was established, it was reinforced every spring when the hawthorn bloomed, and the smell was recognized as the smell that had been forbidden and feared. Holly was an exception to many plant rules. It was brought into houses at midwinter precisely because it was evergreen, because its persistence through the dark months symbolized life and continuity when other plants had died back. The prickles of holly were protective. They caught and held any evil spirits that tried to enter with the decorations. Let us now think about the superstitions associated with bees. Bees were kept throughout the pre-modern world for their honey and their wax, and the keeping of bees generated an enormous body of folk belief. The most important and most widely distributed of these beliefs was the practice of telling the bees. When something significant happened in a household, a birth, a death, a marriage, a major misfortune, the beekeeper had to go to the hives and tell the bees what had happened. The bees were considered members of the household, privy to its secrets and its events. If you failed to inform them, they would leave, or they would not produce honey, or they would die. The telling of the bees at a death was particularly important and particularly elaborate. The beekeeper went to each hive and knocked gently on it and said in a quiet voice that the master was dead, or the mistress was dead, whichever it was. Sometimes a piece of mourning ribbon was tied to each hive. Sometimes the hives were turned slightly, rotated from their usual orientation to mark the disruption of the household's order. This practice was widespread enough across Britain, Northern Europe, and parts of North America that it appears in records from many different regions and periods. The poet John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a poem about it called Telling the Bees, which was published in 1858, and which shows how current the practice still was in his time. The poem describes a young man returning to his beloved's house and seeing a servant telling the bees and realizing from this that his beloved must have died. The intimate relationship implied between the household and its bees, the bees as honorary family members who needed to be kept informed, reflects a genuine quality of the relationship between beekeepers and their hives. Bees are sensitive to disturbance. They respond to stress. They are genuinely affected by what happens around them. The folk belief in their sensitivity to household events may have been based on real observations of bees behaving differently in times of household disturbance, the hive perhaps reflecting the stress of the beekeeper, who was also dealing with whatever difficulty had befallen the household. The practice of telling the bees is, in this reading, not entirely superstition. It is partly a recognition of a genuine relationship between the beekeeper and the hive, a way of acknowledging that relationship, and perhaps a comfort to the beekeeper at a time of loss. The ritual of going to the hives and speaking quietly about what had happened was a way of processing the grief by placing it in the context of the household's continuing life. Let us now consider the superstitions associated with the sea beyond the sailors' traditional practices. Coastal communities throughout northern Europe had complex beliefs about the relationship between the land and the sea, and between humans and the creatures of the sea. Mermaids, though not creatures with physical reality, functioned as omens in the beliefs of fishing communities. Seeing a mermaid was generally a bad sign. It predicted storms or disaster. This belief was perhaps connected to the occasional sightings of actual marine mammals, seals, manatees, dugongs, in unusual circumstances, interpreted through the lens of the existing belief. Seals themselves were believed in Scottish and Irish tradition to be selkies, seal people who could shed their seal skin and walk on land in human form. The ethical complexities of this belief were significant. You should not harm a seal, because it might be a selkie. Fishermen who found a seal injured or distressed should help it, because of the risk of harming a selkie and the retribution that might follow. The seal as transformed human was a belief that humanized the seal, which is a creature whose large eyes and expressive face genuinely do give it an unusually human-like appearance. The folk belief may have arisen from this appearance, from the genuine uncanniness of the seal's resemblance to something human adjacent. The sea was full of things that might be misfortune if disturbed or harmed, and therefore the sea required a certain careful navigating of relationships. Do not harm the seals, do not whistle up the wind, do not bring rabbits aboard ship. Another maritime superstition, the rabbit being an unlucky animal on ships for reasons that varied by tradition, but whose practical effect was to keep a prey animal for which a cat might compete off the ship, which may have served the ship's cat's function of rat control. The word rabbit itself was not to be spoken on a ship in some traditions. The substitute words varied: long ears, bunnies, underground mutton. The specific avoidance of the word was a precaution against the bad luck the animal brought, the logic being that speaking the name summoned the thing named, and the thing named was unlucky. This word avoidance, the taboo on speaking certain words, requiring the use of euphemisms or substitutes, was a widespread feature of folk belief. The direct name of a dangerous thing gave power to that thing, the bear's name. In many Northern European languages, the word now used for bear is a euphemism meaning the brown one or the honey eater, the original word having been taboo, was not to be spoken in the forest, because saying the bear's name would draw the bear's attention. The devil's name was not to be spoken casually, because speaking it might summon him. The various euphemisms, the old one, the black man, the gentleman in black, the deuce, served to refer to the entity without directly invoking it. This word avoidance around dangerous things is not entirely without logic. In a world where much communication was oral and direct, where you learned about the world through what you heard and told rather than what you read, the power of the spoken word to create reality was perhaps more felt. To speak of a disaster was to bring the disaster into the social reality of the community in a way that mattered. The superstitious avoidance of certain words was a kind of linguistic hygiene, a way of keeping dangerous ideas out of the daily conversation. Let us now move toward some of the more ordinary domestic superstitions, the ones that govern the small decisions of daily life in ways that most people probably did not think of as superstition at all, but as simply the correct way of doing things. Rocking an empty chair was bad luck. The rocking of an empty chair invited a spirit to sit in it. This was a belief in various forms across many cultures, and its persistence in folk memory was helped by the fact that an empty chair rocking by itself is an uncanny thing to see. It suggests presence where there is no presence, motion without cause. The superstition gave a name to the uncanniness and a remedy for it. Stop the chair, do not leave it rocking. Opening an umbrella indoors was bad luck. The origin of this belief has been suggested to lie in the sun shields of ancient Egypt, where opening such a device indoors was an insult to the sun god Ra, whose beneficence you were rejecting by shielding yourself from his gift inside a building. This origin may or may not be accurate. Many explanations for superstitious origins are just stories invented after the fact. But the practical dimension is clear. Opening a large umbrella in a small indoor space risked hitting someone or something, and the social penalty of hitting someone with an accidentally opened umbrella was encoded as a bad luck consequence. Placing new shoes on a table, as we have mentioned in the context of shoe superstitions, was bad luck associated with death. A broken mirror was 7 years bad luck. Seeing your own double, your doppelganger, was an omen of death. Walking under a ladder was bad luck. The practical dimension here is real and visible, since things tend to fall off ladders, and the person who walks under a ladder courts that practical risk, but the superstitious framing probably helped enforce the practical caution more effectively than mere practical advice would have. The three-legged symbol of the ladder leaning against a wall formed a triangle, and triangles were sacred geometric forms in various traditions. Breaking the triangle by walking through it disrupted the sanctity of the form, and this disruption was what brought the bad luck. This explanation for the ladder superstition is one of several, and illustrates again how superstitions accumulated explanations over time, different communities and different periods offering different rationales for the same persistent belief. Now, let us slow further and think about the general character of folk belief and superstition, because we have been through many specific examples and it is worth pausing to consider what they have in common. What they have in common is, at the deepest level, a belief in connection. The world of superstition is a world of connections, as between the sign and the thing signified, between the action and the consequence. between the state of one thing and the state of another. Spilling salt and a quarrel are connected not by any physical mechanism, but by the belief in a web of correspondences that underlies the visible world. This belief in a web of correspondences is not stupid. It is in fact one of the fundamental intuitions of science. The world is connected. Things affect other things. Effects have causes. The difference between superstition and science is not in the underlying intuition, but in the method of testing. Science tests its proposed connections rigorously and rejects those that do not hold. Superstition tests its proposed connections loosely and remembers the confirmations better than the disconfirmations. The people who held superstitious beliefs were people who wanted to understand their world and to act effectively within it. They wanted to know why things happened and how to influence events in their favour. The superstitions gave them answers and gave them tools. The answers were not always correct and the tools were not always effective, but the desire that drove them, the desire to understand and to act, was the same desire that drives science. This is perhaps the most sympathetic reading of superstition, not as foolishness, not as irrationality, but as pre-scientific science. The first pass, the accumulation of pattern before the testing of pattern, the use of what was available before better tools were developed, and the better tools, when they came, did not entirely replace the older patterns. They could not, because the older patterns were embedded in culture, in language, in the ritual structures of daily life that were not easily updated when the theoretical foundations they rested on were shown to be wrong. The spilling of the salt still made people uneasy, even when they knew intellectually that there was no physical mechanism by which spilled salt caused quarrels. The unease was cultural, not rational, and culture changes slowly. Let us now settle into the final portion of our time with these old beliefs, because the hour is late and the details have been numerous, and the mind is perhaps beginning to find its way toward the quiet place. The superstitions we have discussed were held by people going about their daily lives, doing the same things we do: cooking, working, sleeping, loving people, worrying about what might go wrong. The specific things they worried about were shaped by the specific dangers of their world: the unpredictable sea, the possibility of witchcraft, the evil eye of a jealous neighbour. But the underlying anxiety was the same anxiety we have, the uncertainty about the future and the desire to have some influence over it. And the rituals they performed to address that anxiety, the salt over the shoulder, the greeting of the magpie, the telling of the bees, were the tools they had for managing it. Not very powerful tools by any objective measure, but tools that gave the feeling of agency, of doing something, of addressing the problem rather than being helpless before it. The feeling of agency is not nothing. It is in fact quite important to well-being. People who feel that they have some control over their circumstances do better, on average, than people who feel entirely helpless, even when the control they have is illusory. The salt over the shoulder was an illusory control over the bad luck that spilled salt might bring. But the act of throwing it, quick, decisive, specific, broke the state of anxiety and moved the person forward into the rest of their day. This is worth something. It is not nothing. And now the rest of the day is done, and the night is here, and the old beliefs are settling into the background where they have always lived. not entirely gone even from modern minds, not entirely replaced by the knowledge that replaced them, but quiet in the corners of the culture, in the phrasings that embed old ideas in new language, in the small private rituals that people perform without quite admitting to themselves that they are performing them. You may have your own. Most people do. The small irrational gesture that you make, not because you really believe it, but because the small cost of making it is worth the peace of mind it provides. That is the inheritance of all these centuries of superstition. Not the specific beliefs, most of which have faded, but the practice, the small ritual gesture, the acknowledgement of the possibility that the world is more connected than it seems, the hedging of bets against outcomes that seem unlikely but cannot be entirely ruled out. It is, in its way, the most human of impulses, to reach for some control over a world that is not entirely controllable, to throw the salt, to greet the magpie, to tell the bees, and then to go on with the day, and now to go on with the night, which means to sleep. The salt is thrown, the magpie is greeted, the bees have been told, everything that can be done has been done, the omens have been attended to, the thresholds are protected, the horseshoe is above the door opening upward, holding the good luck in, and you are inside, warm, protected, with everything that needs to be managed, and the night is here, and sleep is here, and the old beliefs are quiet in the corners where they live, not troubling anyone, simply present, the long inheritance of all the people who looked at the uncertain world and tried to find their footing in it. As you have found your footing, as you find it every night, in the dark, in the quiet, in the reliable return of sleep, good night. For those still awake with the old beliefs, if you are still awake, the superstitions have more to say. They always have more to say. They accumulated over centuries and there is no shortage of them. Let us think about the superstitions around dreams, since we are at the border of sleep. Dreams were one of the primary means by which the supernatural communicated with the living in ancient and medieval belief. The Mesopotamians kept dream journals, recording their dreams and consulting specialists who could interpret them. The ancient Greeks had healing sanctuaries, Asclepiaea, sacred to the god Asclepios, where sick people would sleep in the temple, hoping to receive in their dreams a vision of the god that would show them the cure for their illness. This practice was called incubation, literally sleeping on the ground in the hope of receiving a dream of power. The Hebrews of the Bible received divine communications in dreams. Joseph dreamed of sheaves of wheat and the sun and moon and stars portending his future greatness. Pharaoh dreamed of 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows, which Joseph interpreted as 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Daniel interpreted the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar. God spoke to people in dreams in dozens of passages throughout the Bible. In the Islamic tradition, the true dream, the ruya, is distinguished from ordinary dreams and from confused nightmares. A true dream comes in the early morning before dawn, when the mind is in a particular state of receptivity and carries genuine information from the divine or about the future. The tradition of interpreting dreams in Islamic culture was extensive and highly developed. The medieval Christian tradition was more ambivalent about dreams. Dreams could come from God, in which case they were prophetic and true. They could come from the devil, in which case they were deceptive and false. They could come from the body, in which case they reflected physical conditions, fever, digestion, the humours, rather than spiritual communication. The difficult question was always which kind of dream you were having. Various folk methods for ensuring good dreams and avoiding nightmares were developed throughout the medieval and early modern period. Specific herbs under the pillow. Mugwort was particularly recommended for prophetic dreams, lavender for peaceful ones. Specific prayers said before sleeping. Specific sleeping positions. Sleeping on your left side was recommended against nightmares in some traditions. Sleeping on your back was considered more prone to them because it was the position of the dead. The horseshoe above the bed, like the horseshoe above the door, was protective against nightmares and against the night hag, the supernatural being who was believed to sit on the sleeper's chest and cause the crushing sensation of sleep paralysis. The night hag, called the mare, giving us the word nightmare, was a spirit that could be warded off by iron, by protective symbols, by a stone with a natural hole in it hung above the bed. The stone with a natural hole, a hag stone, or a witch stone, or an adder stone, was a stone in which a hole had been bored by natural erosion, typically through which water had worn a passage. Such stones were found in riverbeds and on beaches, and their naturally formed holes gave them power. You could look through the hole and see things that were invisible to the ordinary eye. You could hang one above the bed and it would trap the night hag, preventing her from riding you. These stones were kept for generations, passed from parent to child, the specific stone accumulating a history that made it more powerful, more trusted, its protection having been relied upon for many years without obvious failure. If you do not have a hag stone above your bed tonight, perhaps this account of what one would do is sufficient protection. The hearing of the description, the invoking of the tradition, the acknowledging of the old belief in a spirit of courtesy rather than conviction. Perhaps this is enough to remind whatever part of your mind still holds the old anxieties that it is attended to, that the old remedies have been remembered, that the old beliefs are still known. And with that acknowledgement made, the mind can settle. The night is here. The old beliefs are quiet. The threshold is protected. The horseshoe holds the luck. The herbs are under the pillow. The stone hangs above. And everything that can be done has been done. And sleep is the next thing. The only thing. Right now. Good night. The counting superstitions. There were superstitions about counting. Specifically, there was a widespread belief in many cultures that certain things should not be counted, because counting fixed them, and fixing them attracted the attention of forces that wished to reduce them. The counting of bees in a hive was bad luck. If you counted your bees, they would leave or die or stop producing. Better not to know the exact number. Better to have an approximate sense of the colony's health, the sound of them, the weight of the hive, the behaviour of the bees, and then to fix them in a number that might attract misfortune. The counting of fish before landing was unlucky in many fishing communities. You counted your catch after it was safely in the boat and headed to harbour, not before. To count fish in the sea, to say we have 12 fish on the line, was to tempt fate, to attract the attention of whatever forces governed fishing luck, to declare your success before it was secured. Counting sheep, the activity we now associate with inducing sleep, had a similar resonance. You counted your sheep in a specific way. the count done in an ancient form of Celtic number words that in some regional dialects was still used in the 19th century. Yan, tan, tethra, methera, pip, sethera, lethera, hovera, dovera, dick, and so on. A counting system clearly descended from ancient Celtic and used specifically for counting livestock, different from the ordinary counting words used for other things. These special counting words for livestock, preserved in some sheep farming communities of northern England into the 19th and even 20th century, suggest that the counting of animals had always been a special activity, done in a special way, separate from ordinary counting. The counting was necessary for the farmer's management of the flock, but it was done with a ritual care that acknowledged the importance of what was being counted, and perhaps made a kind of oblique peace with the forces that might object to the fixing of the number. To count your livestock was, in a way, to challenge whatever had been caring for them. Before you counted them, they were simply your flock, indistinct in number, under the general protection of whatever was protecting them. After you counted them, they were a specific number of animals, a declared quantity, a target. The anxiety of counting is the anxiety of having things, of knowing precisely what you have, and therefore being aware of precisely what you could lose. This anxiety is still with us, though we manage it differently. We do not count our sheep in Celtic number words, but we do have the equivalent of superstitious counting practices, the financial advisors who suggest not checking your investment account every day, the doctors who suggest weighing yourself weekly rather than daily. The principle is the same. Frequent, precise measurement of things you care about intensifies the anxiety of loss. Sometimes not quite knowing is a more peaceful state than knowing exactly. The superstition around counting was a folk understanding of this principle, and now you can stop counting. Whatever you have been counting, the things to do, the things to worry about, the items on the list that the mind keeps running through at this hour, you can stop. The count is done for tonight. Put down the tally. The flock is in the field. The bees are in the hive. The fish are in the sea.
And you are here, in the quiet, in the dark, where the counting
stops and sleep begins. Good night. The last omen. The last omen of the day was whatever you happened to see as you closed the shutters or drew the curtains for the night. For a person in an earlier century, looking out of the window at the gathering dark, the last omen might have been a bat flying past. Bats were generally bad luck, associated with witches and with the night, or a cat sitting on the gatepost, the colour of the cat determining whether the omen was good or bad, or a star falling. Shooting stars were widely interpreted as omens, though of what specifically varied by tradition, or simply the shape of a cloud, or the sound of a distant sound, or the behaviour of the dog in the yard. Everything was potentially significant in the world of folk belief, everything connected to everything else in a web of meaning that the careful observer could read. This total connectivity, the sense that every event was a potential message, every coincidence a potential sign, was both a way of finding meaning in a world that could seem arbitrary and a source of anxiety. If everything was a potential omen, then every moment required interpretation. Nothing could be simply itself. The long history of superstition is partly the history of managing this anxiety. The anxiety of total connectivity, of a world in which nothing was neutral and every event might be significant. The modern world has gone some way toward resolving this anxiety by offering the alternative framework of a world in which most events are causally isolated from each other, in which a black cat crossing your path has no causal connection to what happens to you next. This framework is, in many important respects, more accurate than the superstitious alternative, but it has its own difficulties. A world in which most things are causally isolated from each other is a world with less meaning, a world in which your individual actions have less significance, a world that can sometimes feel very large and very indifferent. The superstitious world was small and connected and full of significance. Everything meant something. The bat and the cat and the falling star were all addressed to you personally, carrying messages relevant to your specific life and your specific concerns. This was wrong, scientifically, but it was warm, humanly. It made the world feel inhabited, attended to, relevant, and perhaps, at this hour, a little of that warm-feeling world is useful. The last omen of today is this: you're here, you are still. The day is done. The omens you encountered today have been seen and noted, and the appropriate responses have been made, however consciously or unconsciously. The horseshoe holds. The salt has been thrown. The magpie was greeted. The bees have been told what they needed to know. And the night is here, and you are protected. By the old beliefs that still live in the corners of the culture, by the new knowledge that has largely replaced them, and by the simple fact of being inside in the warmth at the end of a day that is done. Everything is attended to. Everything is in its place. The world, superstitious or otherwise, is continuing its business in the dark outside your windows, and you are here. And the sleep is here, and it is time. Good night. The luck in ordinary things. Let us now go through some of the superstitions that attach themselves to the most ordinary objects of daily life, because the ordinary objects were the ones most constantly encountered, and the constant encounters gave them the most opportunities to accumulate meaning. The horseshoe has already been mentioned, but let us spend more time with it, because it is one of the most widespread and most durable of all the luck objects. A horseshoe found on the road was particularly lucky, because it had been found rather than bought. The luck came freely, unsolicited, a gift from the world. You picked it up, you carried it home. You hung it over the door. The iron of the horseshoe was the primary source of its power. Iron was almost universally associated with protection against supernatural forces across European folk belief. Fairies could not bear iron. Witches recoiled from it. Evil spirits were repelled by it. Why iron specifically? Several explanations have been offered. Iron was a relatively new technology compared to stone and bronze, and its superior hardness and ability to hold an edge made it seem almost magical to cultures transitioning from bronze. The colour of iron, the dark metallic grey of forged iron, had associations with earthly and solid things, as opposed to the airy and spiritual. The sound of iron being struck, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer on the anvil, was a protective sound. The blacksmith himself was a figure of ambiguity and power in folk belief. He worked with fire and iron, both powerful materials. He transformed raw material into useful objects through a process that was almost alchemical. He occupied a social position that was both essential and slightly marginal. The blacksmith was needed, but the forge was often at the edge of the community rather than the centre, and the blacksmith's trade was considered both powerful and potentially dangerous. The horseshoe that the blacksmith made and that the horse wore and that was eventually cast off and found on the road carried all of this history in its iron body. It had been made by fire and skill. It had been worn by an animal. It had been lost and found. It was ready to protect. The penny, found on the ground, heads up, was a similar object. Found money, particularly found coins, was lucky in many traditions. The finding was the luck. The world had placed this thing in your path, and the taking of it was the accepting of the gift. A penny found tails up was less lucky, or not lucky at all, depending on the tradition, because the heads, the sovereign's head in British, coins, the symbol of authority, was the lucky side, the powerful side. The four-leaf clover was among the most familiar of luck objects, and its rarity was the primary source of its power. Four-leaf clovers are genuinely rare. They occur as a mutation in the three-leafed clover, with a frequency of about 1 in 10,000. Finding one required sustained attention to a ground-level search. The combination of rarity and the effort required to find one gave the four-leaf clover its value. It was proof that luck had specifically singled you out, that your eye had been guided to the one unusual plant among 10,000 normal ones. Carrying the four-leaf clover conferred continued luck, the luck of the finding, preserved and carried. Some people pressed their four-leaf clovers in books and kept them for years, the pressed leaf drying and flattening but retaining its four lobes and its meaning. The lucky number 7 appeared again here. 7 four-leaf clovers found in a day was a superlative of luck, an accumulation so improbable as to be genuinely startling. The rabbit's foot, specifically the left hind foot of a rabbit, killed in a specific way, at a specific time of the lunar cycle, was a powerful luck charm in American and African American folk tradition. The rabbit's foot as luck charm has a complex history, deriving partly from African folk traditions brought to America through the slave trade, and partly from European traditions that also attributed powers to certain animal parts. The specific requirements, left hind foot, specific killing conditions, gave the charm a ritual precision that distinguished the truly powerful object from a merely ordinary rabbit's foot. The rabbit was an ambiguous animal in folk belief generally. In British maritime tradition, the rabbit was bad luck on ships, its name unmentionable. In land-based folk tradition, the rabbit was sometimes lucky and sometimes not. The rabbit's foot navigated this ambiguity by being specifically lucky through ritual requirement. The power was in the correct preparation, not in the animal itself. The wishbone, the furcula, the V-shaped bone from the breast of a chicken or turkey, was a luck object that required 2 people, each pulling one arm of the bone until it snapped. The person who ended up with the longer piece had their wish granted. This practice was widespread across Britain and North America and had ancient precursors. The Etruscans apparently dried and preserved chickens' furculae for oracular use, the cracking of the bone as a form of divination. The wishbone practice had the additional social dimension of requiring a partner. You could not make a wish alone with a wishbone. The wish was embedded in a relationship, in the small competitive intimacy of the 2-person tug. The winner got the wish, but the loser got the experience, the participation in the ritual, the knowledge that someone else was carrying a hope forward. Let us now think about the superstitions of the specific days of the week. Monday was named for the moon, Moon's Day, and inherited both the moon's associations and its own character from the practical realities of being the first day of the working week after Sunday's rest. Starting work on a Monday was considered good in some traditions, bad in others. In Scottish folk tradition, Monday was a good day to start a new project. In other traditions, beginning anything new on a Monday was unlucky. The specific unluckiness or luckiness of specific days for specific activities was a complex grid of folk belief that varied enormously by location and period. In general, Fridays were bad days for new beginnings, the day of the crucifixion, the day of ill omen. Sundays were good days, but sometimes too holy for ordinary work. Wednesdays and Thursdays, Mercury's day and Thor's day, named for the messengers and the gods of practical power, were often considered reasonable working days, neither particularly lucky nor unlucky. The unluckiness of Fridays was compounded by other Friday associations. Friday was the day of the hanging in many European traditions, the day when executions were carried out. Friday was the day when witches' Sabbaths began. A run of 3 Fridays in a row with a particular unlucky event was more significant than if the events happened on 3 different days. Wednesday, the day of Mercury in the Roman naming, was the day of messages and travel and communication. A middle day, a transitional day. It was a day for beginning journeys that needed divine protection, specifically the protection of the messenger god who presided over roads and travellers. Starting a journey on a Wednesday was either very good or very bad, depending on the tradition, the association with travel being one that could cut either way. Sunday, the Lord's Day in the Christian week, was a day of rest in theory and in religious law, but the superstitions surrounding Sunday were complex. Things done on Sunday would persist forever. A weed pulled on Sunday would never return, which was good. But work done on Sunday would unravel. A stitch sewn on Sunday would have to be ripped out by the teeth in hell, the common saying went. The day was sanctified in a way that made it powerful for some purposes and prohibited for others. Let us now think about the year's turning points and the superstitions that clustered around them. The solstices and equinoxes were moments of vulnerability and power in many folk traditions. Midsummer, the summer solstice, was a time when the world was thin between the ordinary and the supernatural, when fairies were abroad, when magical plants had their maximum power, when herbs gathered at midnight were most potent. Midsummer fires were lit in many parts of Europe, bonfires on hillsides, the smoke of which carried prayers and protections for the coming year. Jumping over the midsummer fire was purifying and lucky. The gathering of plants at midsummer was a specialized folk practice. Specific plants gathered at specific hours on the solstice night had powers they would not have at other times. The fern, which was believed wrongly to produce a seed invisible to the naked eye, was supposed to flower at exactly midnight on Midsummer's Eve, and the person who could find and gather this impossible seed would become invisible, or discover hidden treasure, or acquire some other supernatural ability. The fern seed belief is interesting because it is factually wrong in a way that was not discoverable without careful botanical investigation. Ferns reproduce by spores, not seeds, and their reproduction is genuinely more cryptic than flowering plants' reproduction. The incorrect belief that ferns produce seeds, combined with the observation that ferns produced no visible seeds, led to the conclusion that the seeds were invisible. a logical chain that was wrong in its premise but internally consistent. Halloween, the eve of All Saints' Day, the 1st of November, was another thin time in the Celtic calendar, the boundary between the end of the light half of the year and the beginning of the dark half. On this night, the dead could walk. The boundaries between the living and the dead were down. The fairies were abroad. Things that were usually invisible were briefly visible. The specific practices of Halloween, the lighting of fires, the wearing of costumes, the going from house to house, had protective and apotropaic dimensions. You disguised yourself so that the spirits would not recognize you and harm you. You lit fires to keep the darkness at bay. You went from house to house performing small services, singing, praying, saying rhymes, in exchange for food, a practice rooted in the souling tradition where the poor went door to door asking for soul cakes in exchange for prayers for the dead. May Day, the 1st of May, the threshold of summer, was the other end of the Celtic year, the beginning of the light half, the transition from the cold to the warm. May Day was a time of fertility magic. The maypole and its dancing were survivals of much older celebrations of spring and its renewing power. May Day was when you should not bring hawthorn blossom into the house, but you should bring in the first flowers of spring, the garlands of green, the symbols of the returning life. The threshold quality of these dates, solstices, equinoxes, the first days of seasons, made them times when the rules were loosened, when the invisible was more visible, when protective measures needed to be doubled, and the ordinary management of luck required additional attention. And then the threshold passed, and the ordinary days resumed, and the ordinary level of superstitious management was sufficient, until the next threshold. As this night is a threshold of its own kind, the threshold between waking and sleep, between the day and the night that erases it, between the concerns of the day and the simple blankness of unconsciousness. This threshold, like all thresholds, requires only a small ritual crossing. The salt has been thrown. The horseshoe is above the door. The old words have been said, and now you cross into the dark, into the sleep, into the place where the old beliefs do not follow, where there are no signs to read or omens to manage, where the fern seed makes you invisible, and the silver cord is whole, and the ancestors are watching quietly from wherever they watch from, into sleep. Good night. One more superstition for the road. There is one more superstition worth mentioning before we close for the night, and it is perhaps the simplest and most human of all of them. Knocking on wood, touch wood, knock on wood. The gesture is made when you have said something that tempts fate, when you have remarked that things have been going well, or that something bad has not happened, or that you expect good luck to continue. The moment the words are out of your mouth, the hand reaches for wood. The knuckles knock. The protection is made. The origin of this practice has been attributed to many sources. The Druids who worshipped in sacred groves, the touch of the sacred tree invoking its protection, the spirits who lived in trees and could be called upon by touching the wood, the Christian cross of wood, which protected the person who touched it from the consequences of their tempting statements, the pagan tradition of treading carefully around declarations of good fortune, the tree as the vehicle for that care. Whatever its origin, it is among the most widely practiced superstitious gestures in the modern English-speaking world. People who consider themselves entirely rational knock on wood when they say things like, "The flight was never delayed," or "The car has been running perfectly." They know it is not rational. They knock on wood anyway, because it is cheap, because it takes 1 second, because the habit is so deep that not doing it would require more effort than doing it, because there is a small, reasonable-sounding part of the mind that says, well, you don't actually know that it does nothing. This is the survival mechanism of superstition in a rational age, the cheap gesture that costs less than the anxiety of not making it. And so we knock, and the wood receives the knock, and the world continues, as it always has, and the night continues, and the sleep continues to approach, and the old beliefs are quiet in their corners, and everything has been done that can be done, and the wood has been touched, and the salt has been thrown, and the magpie has been greeted, and the horseshoe is holding, and the bees have been told, and you are here, and the night is here, and sleep is right here, at the edge of this moment, waiting for you to cross the threshold. Cross it. Good night. The superstitions around weather. The weather was one of the most consequential unknowns in pre-modern life, and the prediction of it was a matter of genuine practical importance. Without weather forecasts, without barometers, without satellite imagery, the people of earlier centuries developed their own ways of reading the signs that the sky and the land provided. Some of these signs were genuinely predictive. Red sky at morning, sailor's warning. Red sky at night, sailor's delight, is a piece of weather lore that has actual meteorological validity in mid-latitude regions where weather systems move from west to east. A red sky in the morning means that dust particles are illuminated by the rising eastern sun, and those particles have been moved ahead of a weather system moving from the west. The system is coming. A red sky at night means the particles are to the west, ahead of clear air moving in. The folk wisdom in this case captured a real pattern. Other weather lore was less reliable but equally seriously held. The behavior of animals before storms, cows lying down, birds flying low, spiders abandoning their webs, was read as a forecast. Some of this animal behavior may have genuine meteorological basis. Changes in air pressure that precede storms affect animals in ways that their behavior reflects, or the observations may have been selectively remembered, the accurate predictions noted, and the inaccurate ones forgotten. Groundhog Day, the 2nd of February, when the groundhog's behavior supposedly predicted the length of winter, is a formalized version of the more general folk practice of reading animal behavior for weather predictions. Whether or not the groundhog's shadow accurately predicts the weather is a matter on which the data is not encouraging, but the practice persists because it is delightful, and because it marks a point in the calendar, the midpoint of winter, that is worth marking, and because the longing for spring that practice expresses is genuine and universal. The persistence of weather lore into the present day, when accurate weather forecasting is available, illustrates the cultural durability of these practices. The red sky observation still resonates even for people who check weather apps. The groundhog still appears on February the 2nd in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, before a large and enthusiastic crowd. The practices survive the knowledge that makes them unnecessary. This is, again, the story of superstition's persistence. The belief becomes habit, becomes tradition, becomes cultural fixture. It is no longer believed in the original sincere way, but it is practiced in a lighter way, a way that acknowledges its non-literal quality while still finding meaning in the performance. The meaning is not the weather forecast. The meaning is the community gathered to watch the groundhog, the shared acknowledgement of the season, the collective expression of the desire for warmth and growth. The superstition is the vehicle for the meaning, not the meaning itself. And the meaning, the seasonal observance, the community gathering, the expression of hope, that is not nothing. Let us now think about the superstitions around wealth and poverty, because the management of fortune was one of the central concerns of folk belief across all cultures. The finding of a coin was lucky, as we have mentioned. But there were more specific beliefs about how to attract and keep wealth. Never spend the last coin in your purse. Always keep one coin to prevent the purse from being entirely empty, because an empty purse attracted poverty. Keep a small amount of money in a new wallet or purse before giving it as a gift, to ensure that it would never be empty for its new owner. The principle here was one of continuity. Wealth was like a fire. It needed to be sustained, not allowed to go out entirely. A completely empty purse, like a completely dead fire, was a state that was hard to recover from. Better to keep the seed of wealth in place, however small, and let it grow back from that seed. The specific denominations of coins had their own meanings. A silver coin in the shoe of the bride was thought to bring prosperity to the marriage. Hence the something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and a sixpence in your shoe formula of British wedding tradition. The sixpence in the shoe was the luck of the threshold, carried into the new life. The wren was the king of birds in British tradition, a title won, in one version of the story, by the cleverness of the small bird who hid on the eagle's back, as the eagle flew higher than any other bird, and then launched itself from the eagle's back at the last moment, flying a little higher on its own effort, winning the competition by cunning rather than power. The Wren King brought luck to those who honoured it, and the wren hunting tradition. The hunting of a real wren on St. Stephen's Day, the 26th of December, was a midwinter ritual that inverted the normal order, the king of birds being sacrificed at the turning of the year in a pattern common to many midwinter sacrificial traditions. The coin was also a threshold object in its own right. Coins thrown into wells, wishing wells, were an offering to the spirit of the well, the water spirit, in exchange for a granted wish. This practice was so widespread that it is still practiced daily at fountains and wells throughout the world, the original superstitious meaning largely forgotten, but the gesture preserved. Throwing a coin into the Trevi fountain in Rome ensures your return to Rome, according to tradition. Millions of euros of coins are thrown into the Trevi fountain annually. The fountain's management donates the money to charity. The gesture continues. The persistence of the wishing well and the coin in the fountain into the thoroughly modern present is perhaps the single clearest example of how completely superstitious practices can outlast their theoretical foundations. Nobody believes that the spirit of the Trevi fountain grants wishes, but the coin goes in anyway, because the gesture is pleasurable, because it marks a moment of hope, because it connects the thrower to every other person who has thrown a coin into a fountain with a wish, because the wish itself, whatever it was, deserves to be marked. Let us now think about one final category of superstition, which is the superstitions around sleep itself. We are, after all, at the threshold of sleep, and sleep had its own body of folk belief. Sleeping with your feet toward the door was bad luck in some traditions. This was the position of the dead, laid out in their coffins with the feet toward the door for easy carrying out. Sleeping with your head in the north was bad in other traditions. North was the direction of death and cold. Sleeping with your head in the east was the most propitious orientation in some traditions, the east being the direction of the rising sun, and therefore of life and beginning. Never fall asleep with your shoes on. It was the position of a drunk, and it was also the position of a person who had not properly prepared for sleep, who was not in right relationship with the night. Taking off your shoes was the ritual of preparation for sleep, the marking of the transition from the world of action to the world of rest. Not sleeping with a hat on, taking off the hat when you came inside and certainly before you lay down, was another transition marker. The hat was the public garment, the garment of the world. Inside, at rest, you did not need it. Never leave scissors open near the bed. Scissors that were open were cutting, even lying still, cutting the thread of some invisible thing. Close them. Put them away. Let the sharp things be still. Never look at the new moon through glass. A superstition about the new moon that required you to see it directly, not through a window, because glass interrupted the direct relationship between the observer and the moon, and indirect relationship with the new moon was unlucky. These bedtime superstitions were the rituals of preparing for the night. The closing of scissors, the removal of shoes, the correct orientation of the sleeper. These were the small acts of right relationship with the night, the acknowledgement that sleep was a passage, a threshold crossing, a nightly journey, and that threshold crossings deserved their proper observance. And now yours. The scissors are closed, the shoes are off, the hat is put away, the feet are pointing in a suitable direction, the window is closed against the new moon's indirect view, the horseshoe is holding, the salt has been thrown, the wood has been touched, and everything else has been done, or left undone, according to whatever tradition you carry, consciously or not. And the night is here, and the superstitions are quiet, and the old beliefs are in their corners, and the long centuries of people managing their luck and reading their omens and telling their bees and greeting their magpies are in their rest, as you are in yours, or going to yours, right now, this moment, the threshold. Cross it. Sleep. Good night. The last superstition of the night. There is a superstition, found in various forms across different cultures, that says, if you name the thing you fear, you give it power. So you do not name it. You go around it. You use the euphemism. You speak of it sideways. And there is the opposite superstition, equally widespread. To name a thing is to master it. The true name of a spirit once known gives you power over it. The witch could be defeated if you knew her true name. Rumpelstiltskin lost everything when his name was spoken aloud. These two superstitions are in direct contradiction. One says naming gives power to the named. The other says naming gives power to the namer. They are both, in different situations, true. There are things in your life that grow larger and more frightening when named. When you say out loud that you're afraid of something, it sometimes grows. And there are things that shrink when named. The fear that is made small by speaking it. the anxiety that loses power when it's identified and described. The old people knew this, though they expressed it in the language of spirits and witches rather than in the language of psychology. They knew that words had power. They knew that some words should be used carefully, and some should be used boldly. They developed elaborate systems of knowing which words were which. We have our own versions of these systems, less elaborate, less superstitious, but built on the same observation, that the way we talk about things affects how those things feel. And so, for tonight, we will use the names that make things small, the worry that is keeping you up, small, the thing you are afraid of, small, the task that looms, manageable, the thing you cannot control, acknowledged, set aside. These are the right words for this hour, the ones that make things small enough to cross the threshold past, and then the threshold is crossed, and the night is on the other side, and sleep is on the other side, and the old superstitions are quiet in their corners, their work done, their long service to humanity acknowledged and gently released. They served their purpose. For centuries they gave people something to do with their fear. And now, for tonight, the fear is small, and the night is large, and sleep is right here, and you are crossing the threshold. Now, good night.